I remember exactly what the air smelled like the morning I found out. Coffee I hadn't touched yet, and something else, the specific stillness of a house that had been violated. I stood in my own kitchen for a long time before I moved. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to where this actually began. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I spent 31 years as a licensed estate attorney in Central Ohio. I drew up wills, settled disputes, protected families from their worst impulses toward each other. I had seen every variation of human greed that exists within the bounds of a family tree. I thought I was immune to it. I thought knowing how it worked would keep me safe. I was 63 years old when my wife Carol died. Pancreatic cancer. She was diagnosed in February and gone by October, and I have never in my life felt so completely alone as I did in that house the first winter without her. We had been married 41 years. She made the coffee every morning. She kept the bird feeders filled. She was the reason any of it worked. We had one son. His name is Douglas. Doug was 40 at the time of his mother's death. A grown man, successful, a project manager for a large construction firm. He lived about 20 minutes away with his wife, Renee, and their 2 kids. I had always considered myself lucky in that regard. Some people lose their children to distance, to estrangement, to choices that can't be undone. My son lived 20 minutes away and came for dinner most Sundays. Renee was polished in a way that Carol never needed to be. Carol was warm and direct. Renee smiled at the right moments and said the right things, and I had never been able to decide whether I liked her or simply respected her performance. But she was good to my grandchildren, and Doug seemed happy, and I told myself that was what mattered. After Carol died, Doug suggested they come around more often. I agreed. I was lonely in ways I couldn't fully articulate, and having my grandchildren in the house, Emma, who was 9, and Marcus, who was 6, brought a noise and a warmth that the rooms desperately needed. So they came on Saturdays, then Saturdays and Wednesdays. Then Renee started stopping by during the week when Doug was at work, bringing the kids after school, staying for dinner. I told myself it was kindness. I told myself that for almost a year. In my office, the room Carol had always called the library because I kept every book I'd ever owned. I kept my files. 3 filing cabinets, color-coded by category, the same system I'd used for decades. Estate documents, insurance policies, investment accounts, the deed to the house, Carol's jewelry inventory with photographs and appraisals for insurance purposes. I also kept physical copies of everything related to my own estate plan. My will, my beneficiary designations, my advance directive. I am not a paranoid man. I have never kept cash stuffed in a mattress or hidden gold coins in the backyard. What I had was documentation, organized and accessible, because I had spent 3 decades watching families tear themselves apart over papers that nobody could find or verify. I knew better than most people alive exactly what a will meant and what it could be made to mean in the wrong hands. Renee knew I was an estate attorney. She knew what I kept in that office. I had been transparent about it because I had no reason not to be. Carol and I had simple, clear intentions. Everything to Doug, held in trust for the grandchildren, if Doug predeceased us, with specific bequests for Carol's jewelry to go to Emma when she turned 25. I had updated my will 6 months after Carol's death, just routine maintenance, removing Carol as executor, appointing a colleague named Harrison who had handled estates for as long as I had. I hadn't told Doug about the changes, not because I was hiding anything, but because it wasn't a conversation I wanted to have. He knew he was the primary beneficiary. The rest was paperwork. The first thing I noticed was small. In April of the following year, I was looking for a folder related to Carol's life insurance. The final distribution had been delayed by a clerical issue, and I needed to follow up. I went to the second filing cabinet, 3rd drawer, where I had kept it. The folder was there, but it wasn't where I had left it. It was 3 folders out of sequence, not dramatically displaced, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying close attention. I was paying close attention because 31 years of document management had made me constitutionally incapable of not noticing when something was out of order. I put it back in its correct position and didn't say anything. I began paying attention differently after that. Over the next several weeks, I noticed other small things. A drawer that didn't sit flush the way I kept it. A file label that seemed to have been replaced. Same label, but the adhesion slightly different at the edge, as if it had been peeled and restuck. My office had a lock on the door. I hadn't been using it because there was no reason to. There was no reason to, I had thought. I started locking it. I also, quietly, requested a copy of the county recorder's office records on my property. This is the kind of thing that sounds dramatic, but for an estate attorney, it is simply routine. I knew what to look for. I knew how documents moved through systems and what their movement signified. What I found made me sit very still for a very long time. A quitclaim deed had been filed 3 weeks earlier. My property, my house, the house Carol and I had bought in 1987 and paid off in full by 2009, had been transferred via quitclaim deed to a limited liability company I had never heard of. The deed bore a signature that was meant to look like mine. It wasn't mine. I have a very particular signature. Carol always teased me about it. 31 years of signing legal documents had made my signature almost illegible, a single hard line, a distinctive loop at the end, something between a physician's scrawl and a seismic reading. The signature on that deed was a careful, practiced forgery. Someone had studied my signature and tried to replicate it slowly enough that it looked deliberate rather than fluid. The LLC's registered agent address was a mailbox service in Dublin, Ohio. The LLC had been formed 4 months earlier. I did not call Doug. I called Harrison instead. Harrison had been my colleague for 26 years. He was the kind of man who said very little and meant everything he said. I drove to his office that afternoon, laid the recorder's documents on his desk, and watched him read them twice. Then he looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "How do you want to handle this?" I said, "Carefully and completely." That conversation lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, we had a plan. I want to explain why I didn't go straight to the police, because I know that's what most people would do, and I know from the outside it can look like stubbornness or ego. It wasn't either of those things. It was strategy. Here's what I knew from 31 years of practice. If you move too fast on property fraud, you give the other party time to construct a defense. LLCs can be dissolved. Documents can be explained away. Witnesses can become unavailable. The forgery on that deed was good enough to create reasonable doubt if the case wasn't built properly. I had seen families lose everything in court because they rushed. I was not going to rush. What I needed was pattern. Not one incident, but a documented series. And I needed to understand the full scope of what had been attempted before I made any move that would alert whoever was behind it. Harrison engaged a forensic document examiner, someone we had used in contested estate cases, to analyze the deed. He also began quietly researching the LLC. I went home and changed every password I had. I installed a small camera in my office, angled at the filing cabinets. I told nobody. I want to be honest about what the next several weeks felt like, because I think people imagine that having a plan makes something like this easier. It doesn't. I sat across from my son at dinner twice a week. I watched my grandchildren draw pictures at my kitchen table. I helped Marcus with his reading and told Emma about her grandmother and tried to be present and normal while holding this thing inside me like a stone. Renee brought me casseroles. She asked how I was sleeping. She touched my arm when she said goodbye and looked at me with what appeared to be genuine concern, and I smiled and said I was fine. I was not fine, but I was patient. The forensic examiner confirmed what I already knew. The signature on the deed was a forgery, inconsistent with my verified signature samples across multiple documents going back 15 years. She prepared a 12-page report that documented the specific inconsistencies in stroke pressure, angle of approach, and letter formation. The LLC research turned up more. It had been formed with a small initial investment from a bank account that, with some careful tracing, connected back to a joint account that Doug and Renee maintained separately from their primary accounts. The LLC had also, apparently, made one inquiry to a commercial real estate broker about listing a residential property in the area. The property had not been formally listed, but the inquiry had been made. They had been planning to sell my house. I want you to understand what that means. Carol's house, the house where Doug grew up, the room where Marcus learned to walk. They had planned to forge my signature, transfer ownership to a shell company, and sell it, while I was living in it, while they were coming for Saturday dinners and asking how I was sleeping. Harrison and I brought everything to the county prosecutor's office. We did not go to the local police, not because we didn't trust them, but because property fraud of this nature involving forged legal documents, a fraudulent LLC, and potential wire fraud, if any electronic communication had been used to facilitate the scheme, warranted federal involvement as well. The prosecutor agreed. By the end of our first meeting, there were 3 agencies with an interest in the case. I still hadn't said a word to Doug. The call came on a Thursday morning in September. It was Doug, and he didn't sound like my son. He sounded like someone who had just been told something that rearranged everything he understood about his own life. His voice was high and strange, and the first thing he said was, "Dad, what did you do?" I said, "Tell me what happened." What had happened was that federal investigators had made contact with Renee. They had presented her with the forged deed, the LLC documentation, the bank records, and the forensic examiner's report. They had also, and this was the part that took the air out of the room when I found out, discovered that this was not the first time. Before she married Doug, Renee had been investigated in another county for a similar scheme involving an elderly relative. That case had been settled civilly. No criminal charges had been filed. She had done this before. She had seen something in Doug, a mother who had recently died, a father who was aging, a family with assets and no complicated structure around them, and she had married into position. I don't know exactly what Doug knew and when he knew it. I have thought about this more than I have thought about almost anything in the past several years. I have turned it over in every direction, and I still don't have a clean answer. What I believe is that Doug was not a full participant. What I also believe is that there were signs he chose not to see, and that choosing not to see something is its own form of decision. He asked me why I hadn't come to him when I first found out. I said, because I didn't know where the line was. He was quiet for a long time after that. Renee was charged with forgery of a public document, identity fraud, and attempted grand theft by false pretense. The federal wire fraud charge came later, when investigators confirmed that she had used email to correspond with the commercial real estate broker about the property that she did not own and had no legal right to sell. The LLC was dissolved. The quitclaim deed was voided on record. My house remained my house. Carol's jewelry, which had been stored in a fireproof box in my closet and which I had not mentioned to anyone, including Harrison, until I was ready, was untouched. It occurred to me later that Renee had likely known about the jewelry inventory in my files. She may have been waiting until the property transfer was complete before moving on to the next item, or she may have considered it too difficult to fence without tracing. I don't know. But Emma will receive it when she turns 25, as Carol intended, as I put in writing, and as no one will be altering. Doug and Renee's marriage did not survive the criminal proceedings. He filed for divorce before the case went to trial. He was cooperative with investigators. He sat in my kitchen one evening in October, the first anniversary of Carol's death, which I don't think either of us planned, and we talked for a long time about things that were hard to talk about. I told him I didn't know if I could fully trust him again. I told him I thought he was a good man who had made a serious error in judgment that lasted for years. He didn't argue with me. He just sat there and listened, and at some point during that conversation he started crying, and I handed him a napkin, and that was the closest thing to absolution I was able to offer. It wasn't nothing. But it wasn't everything, either. He has custody of Emma and Marcus. They still come on Saturdays. Emma is 12 now, and she asks me sometimes about her grandmother, what she was like when she was young, what she cared about. I tell her everything I can remember. Marcus has started reading on his own chapter books, real ones, and he reads to me sometimes when it's late and he doesn't want to go to sleep yet, and I let him, because those evenings are something I will not be rushing past. Renee was sentenced to 27 months. She is out now, I'm told, living in another state. I think about what would have happened if I hadn't been an estate attorney, if I hadn't noticed the misfiled folder, if I hadn't known to check the recorder's office, or known what I was looking at when I found the deed, or known who to call and how to build a case that wouldn't collapse under pressure. I think about how many people in my position wouldn't have known any of those things. How many elderly people have sat in houses they no longer legally owned without knowing it. That thought stays with me. The morning after Harrison called to tell me the deed had been formally voided and the case was moving forward, I went into my office and I sat at my desk, and I looked at Carol's photograph, the one from our 25th anniversary, The one where she's laughing at something I said, and I'm looking at her like I still can't believe my luck, and I said out loud, to nobody, I handled it. The house smelled like coffee. The bird feeders needed filling. I put on my coat and went outside into the October cold and filled every one of them. And then I stood there for a while in the yard that had almost not been mine anymore, in the place where my son had learned to ride a bike, and my grandchildren had caught fireflies, and Carol had grown tomatoes she was irrationally proud of, and I breathed the cold air, and I let it be enough. It was enough. I am 66 years old. I still take on the occasional case, smaller ones, old clients who need estate updates, nothing that requires the hours I used to keep. I keep my office locked now, not out of fear, but out of habit, the way you check the stove before you leave, even when you're certain you turned it off. I have updated my will twice since that year, with Harrison as executor and a secondary executor named, in case Harrison predeceases me, because I am an estate attorney and I know that no system is more reliable than the person maintaining it. The filing cabinets are still color-coded. The documents are still where they belong. Last spring, Emma asked me what I did when I was a lawyer, what it actually meant, the work of it. I told her that mostly it meant helping people protect what they had built and making sure it went where they wanted it to go when they were gone. She thought about that for a moment, and then she said, "So you kept things safe?" I said, "Yes, that's exactly what I did." She nodded like that made sense to her, like it was the right job for the kind of person she understood me to be. Then she asked if she could have a snack, and I said yes to that too, and we went to the kitchen together. And for a little while the house was full of noise again. That, more than anything, is what I was protecting.